I'm excited to have another conversation with two gentlemen today. We're going to be talking about GIS and how utilities are using GIS and digital twins and locational and spatial technologies and data. So please welcome to the stage Matt Piper, the Global Director of Industry Solutions at ESRI, and Adrian Rodriguez, Senior VP of Regulatory Strategy at PSE. Thank you guys both for being here today. Very excited to have you at ETS. Matt, you want to give just a quick intro?
Yeah, thank you, and pleasure to be here. Pleasure to see people in real life again. If this is being streamed on YouTube, they'll be able to turn the closed captions on. Unfortunately for everybody else, you're just going to have to try and guess what my Australian is saying. So it is really good. But I must say that was probably one of the big benefits out of virtual. They could turn on the closed captions, so I didn't have to translate the whole sessions all the time. But it is a pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks, Erin. Happy to see you all again. I'm honored to be asked to join another panel. Obviously, for those of you who were here yesterday, I had the chance of being introduced to you all, and due to some technical difficulties, I am back again. So thank you for having me again. I'm honored to be here, and I thank you, Erin. I just want to note, thank ETS for a wonderful conference that you all put on every year. I'm just glad that it's back in person, so thank you, Energy Thought Summit.
Yeah. Excited to have you. All right, so we're just going to jump right into the discussion here. We're talking about GIS, locational data. Adrian, can you talk a little bit about how your utility is addressing some of the challenges of having more distributed energy resources on the grid?
So absolutely, and I think for the first part of it, I think we're pretty much set that in the background, GIS is integral to all the work that we do. And I know that it's been scaled up at higher and expanded in utilities. For example, I was previously at a utility where we had it just simply on our distribution system, and we now then moved it over to our transmission system. So the question of whether GIS is integral to the work that we do, we've clearly established that across the industry. It is something that we're always looking for, and it helps us do the work that we do. And that will then enable us to move to the next generation of distributed energy resources. So that's going to then allow us to have more. Yesterday there was a conversation from Carlos at National Grid who talked about there being platforms. GIS is an example of that platform that is going to allow us to do something and scale it like distributed energy resources. As it pertains to Puget Sound Energy, where I'm at in the Pacific Northwest, we are embarking on a high degree of distributed energy resources, including, and as I had mentioned on a panel yesterday, having a pending RFP for distributed energy resources that is part of the state's clean energy transition. So it is expected from our customers, mandated by policymakers, and the great thing is that GIS and the next generations of GIS are going to allow us to do DER in a more precise manner that is going to help us effectuate a cleaner energy and providing that to our customers.
Great, thank you. And Matt, you kind of talked about, helping visualize the 3Ds of 3D of 3Ds. So maybe you can expand on what Adrian just talked about.
Yeah, well, I mean, Adrian touched on it perfectly there. The industry's changing, and the rapid expansion of DERs onto the grid, it's meaning that the grid has to change, and the way we model it, manage it, and respond to problems needs to change as well. So from an ESRI's perspective, we're looking at it from the 3Ds in 3D. And I know that digital twins is something that's probably been around since early 2000s. I'm not new to the term, but the technology's come a long way. And I think that's one of the biggest transformations on the capabilities that we can now do. So for us, when we start talking about digital twins now, it's actually bringing all of these elements together to create effectively a life cycle of information management, from being able to capture the information at scale. So this is the imagery processing, this is the satellite imagery coming through, the use of drones. The use of drones is much like QR codes, I think, after COVID, right? Everything had to get digitized so fast, and the use of drones has really taken off. And the ability for us to capture that information, process it now, get it back into the hands of the users to create really beautiful 3D maps Then we start making decisions on it. And that's really accelerating the adoption of the GIS. And I think the other thing that's probably really worth pointing out is that when you talk GIS now, and this is one of those, mind sort of changing thought processes, the GIS is not just the points, lines, and polygons on your map. It's the mobility platform, it's the imagery, it's the ability to process information behind the scenes, it's the business intelligence dashboards that come out of it. It's what's running your control rooms now, back in the control room with the real-time data feeds coming back through. So the GIS now is, to Adrian's point, it's pervasive across the whole organisation through many different departments.
Speaking of that behind the scenes and looking within an organization, what are some of the ways that locational data can be used to bridge different areas within an organization and share data?
Yeah, so if you think about the data that's available now, I mean, if you're in asset management, you would always be thinking, I just need to know where my assets are, I need to know the age of them. Then we move into some condition monitoring and we start tracking the condition. The where factor creates a different element in you understanding those assets. But what we're really starting to find now is that there's so many other different information models that utilities need to bring in. And I mean, we go to any utility and we ask them, what's the biggest challenge you've got? It's always something to do with data. Data is always one of the biggest concerns that utilities have. So we've sort of broken this out into digestible chunks of information modelling now when you're bringing stuff into your GIS. The first main information model that we use is the land-based information model, and that's really where GIS began. That's the terrain modelling, the environment, but we're also bringing in all these new social and demographic data sets. So that's the land-based information model. The next component, if you've been keeping pace with what GIS is doing, is the building information models. So if you've ever worked in the AEC sector, they live and breathe CAD drawings and Revit files, and they're very familiar with working in 3D. We're now working with Autodesk, and we've released a product called GeoBIM, which streamlines those workflows and connects the Autodesk Construction Cloud to the ESRI cloud, which has streamlined those workflows. So that's the BIM. The next component, and I've had a couple of conversations with people, is about the network information model. This is that whole connectivity of all of your networks, so you can do upstream, downstream traces, and really understand that, the way that your network is operating. So that's the network information model. And the last model is the city information model. So more and more now we're seeing these relationships that need to exist between the Department of Energy, the Department of Transports, working with state and local councils, working with FEMA for natural disaster response, and the ability to share this information at a scale which is well beyond just understanding your asset. It's actually scaling back and looking at things at a city level or a smart city level. So they're the different information models that we've been working through. The GIS is not your digital twin, right? Just to be clear, no one product is a digital twin. A digital twin is an ecosystem of all these different information models coming together. The GIS is just fortunate that it's location-based and everything has a location. So that allows you to connect all these different information models in a way that you can't do without any other system.
Great, thank you. So let's get back to the 3Ds of decarbonization. Adrian, your utility has some really ambitious net zero emissions goals. So you've got net zero by 2030 and then carbon-free electricity supply by 2045. So how do you see GIS or locational data playing a role in helping you meet those goals?
So if we've got distributed energy resources and now we're looking at locations in our service territory that are essentially now the sources of power generation, it's now no longer just knowing or thinking that we know where the power plant is, we know where the substantive large utility scale source of power is. We're going to need to actually know precisely where these distributed energy resources are. And it's via AMI, GIS, and the next generations of it that are going to allow us to really be able to maintain a balanced grid, especially on the distribution side. We know how to balance very well as an industry a transmission grid. And now, however, now that we're going to be adding generation resources going in the other direction on the distribution grid, it's needing to know where those locations are. And that's precisely what's going to allow us to be able to enable having DERs and to use them effectively. I think that there's things that we can do technologically right now with distribution to start making the power flow two directions. But it's another thing to say that we actually precisely know where these resources are and how they're generating. One thing that we're going to look at, for example, let's take weather patterns, for example, especially if you've got a service territory in which the weather can change the nature of your distributed energy resource. If you, for example, have wind or solar at a distributed level, is it windy in a specific portion of your service territory? Is it sunny? Is a cloud coming over a certain portion of it? Those things can really impact what we need to do, especially at peak usage times. And it's this technology that's going to enable us to really pinpoint where power is coming from and what we need to do in order to effectively balance the grid at the distribution level.
Is that something you're hearing more from other utilities about, Matt? Are they asking you questions about how they can use GIS and these models for their goals?
Yeah, I was in Dubai 2 weeks ago, and one thing that Dubai's got plenty of is sunshine, right? It's hot. It was really hot. And their layout of distributed energy resources is, foundational to them offsetting the effectively capital expenditure of having to build new substations. So they're really looking at it from a point of view that their design standards are changing at the buildings. They're trying to make their buildings a lot more green, but they are building at such a rapid rate. It is phenomenal the amount of buildings that are going up. But to offset that and defer the capital expenditure of just continuously building new substations, they're using the GIS to do site selections. They're doing exactly what Adrian was talking about, working out, in these areas, how much sunshine do I get? The biggest challenge they've got is that as the sun moves, of course, it throws massive shadows across all the buildings behind it. So there's a lot of shadow analysis and a lot of that sort of view shed analysis that's being used to understand, yes, we've got big footprints on our rooftops, but if the building next to it is casting a huge shadow over it, which is happening a lot, then it's not as effective, and the utilisation of those solar panels drops. So that's just one example, but of many that we're seeing. But I think the understanding about where you need to have the distributed energy resources, the understanding of future forecasting about how the population's growing, the use of and adoption of the distributed energy resources, the GIS is just really helping, position and understand, how we move forward.
So we've been talking about this subject from the utility perspective. Let's talk about the customer perspective a little bit. Adrian, what are some of the challenges that you're facing in helping customers who are becoming more and more interested in using renewable energy and distributed resources?
So I think that one of the first challenges that you generally have is this expectation that everybody is going to have it. And so this, touched, some of the panels have touched upon an equity discussion. And again, this is a conversation that our regulators and legislators are having as well. So this is probably one of the barriers that you have as it being a distributed energy resources and making sure that it's widespread. It's making sure that it's equitably distributed. Or are we developing programs, and this is something that we think about at Puget Sound Energy quite often, is how do we provide a distributed energy resource type product for customers who don't own their own homes or live in apartment complexes? And so we, in the industry, a lot of this has come through community solar. Are we able to possibly do more community solar at some smaller scales in neighborhoods to make it available to customers who may not necessarily have the means or to be able to put a distributed energy resource in their home or apartment? And that is what I would note is a challenge, but it's a conversation that we as an industry are having, and it's one that is expected by our policymakers and customers.
And Matt, from your perspective, how can GIS help utilities better understand their customers?
So I worked for 20 years at a power company in Australia, and I still remember the conversation that I had with our executives when we made this shift from being asset-centric to customer-centric. Does everyone remember that? And it was probably about 10 or 15 years ago where the business model actually changed. But in hindsight, when I look back on that, it didn't really change the way that we operated our business. Like we started to understand, okay, the customer now has choice. The customer becomes a prosumer instead of a consumer. But did we really understand the customer any better? Right? They were still just a load profile at the end of the line. We didn't understand the customer. We didn't have any information on them about their usage and what their usage was. And Lindsay McDoodle from Autin Energy was in a webinar with me once, and she opened my eyes up a little bit, and she sort of gave us this insight into that the people that purchase electric vehicles are a certain income, they're a certain demographic, and once one person in the street gets it, right, it's like keeping up with the Joneses. Like more and more people will start getting electric vehicles, and it has this impact. And also brought in this notion of range anxiety, which meant that even if you have an electric vehicle, you don't really like to be within 5 miles outside of the range of a charging station. So which do you build first? So by looking at that sort of analysis on customers, you start thinking, okay, we've got to put the infrastructure in place. We've got to understand our customers. But we start to understand them in a new way, that if you are of this sort of demographic and you're earning this much money and you're living in these postcodes, then you're more likely to make these decisions. So we can run incentive programs. We can actually work to encourage customers to, and understand their behaviours to adjust the way that we're managing our grids. And that is like systemic across many different types of profiling of customers that we can do now. And whether or not you've used it or not, but the GIS has 1 million layers underneath it now of tapestry data that is a conglomeration of all the census data. It's understanding who's likely to buy an electric vehicle. It's who's likely to drive to the corner store to buy groceries versus those going to use DoorDash. All that sort of information about customers exists, and that's the sort of information now that utilities are starting to bring in to better understand the decisions that their customers are going to make moving forward.
Erin, there's one example that Matt utilized in his previous answer that I thought was particularly helpful, and it helps us on the planning front as it relates to some of our own build. You used the example about substations in Dubai. That's a perfect example of, with having additional data, you can now effectively deploy some of the utility scale resources in a way that are more effective and efficient. And this way, when it comes time to talk to regulators about cost recovery, you now have additional data to show that this is what a prudent utility would do. It would utilize the available data that it has, and when you have a substation in a particular area, it's because you have done the analysis to show we needed it here, but because of the analysis and data that we have from distributed energy resources, we know that we didn't need to deploy substations in these other areas. So it effectively shows a really prudent use of resources.
Adrian, you touched a little bit on equity earlier in the conversation. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on that and how your utility is prioritizing different customers within your service territory.
So one of the things that we did is we have an equity advisory group. And this is a group of individuals and organizations who are not necessarily part of the normal stakeholdering processes. They're not the groups that show up at integrated resource plan public meetings. These are not the groups that show up in front of the state commissions or city councils. And we provide a primer on what our industry is. We, again, showing items such as GIS and the data that we utilize, and let them understand how energy is provided to them. In those conversations, we also hear what they themselves want to prioritize. When you tell some of them about a conversation about solar panels, you now get the feedback of, I'm a home renter, or I live in an apartment. That's not something that I can put on my roof. Okay, now it changes the dynamic of the conversation that we're having and thinking about distributed energy resources and recognizing what can we do to provide a different type of product. What can we solicit from vendors that is different than what we would normally expect from the customers who generally are present at integrated resource planning meetings, commission meetings, and city councils. So with that data, that information, and that feedback via this stakeholdering process that we have sought out to get this with a different group of customers, that feedback is helpful because now we can say that we have thought about these other segments of our customer base that may not necessarily be present in our other proceedings.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Yesterday, Nancy Bowie Thompson was talking exactly about that, about the people who have the time and the freedom to show up to meetings are not necessarily the least affluent of the customers. So Thank you for that. Matt, what about from your perspective, from the GIS perspective in addressing these equity challenges?
Probably the best example I can give when talking about equity is it was from Dominion. Last year we did a webinar with Dominion, and the VP of operations gave a presentation, and just at the end of it, just loosely threw in this operational dashboard that he'd created. And what it was that they had a major outage, and they actually had to report back to the regulator the prioritisation about how they restored people, and then had to justify whether or not they did it in an equitable way. Right, so just think about that for a moment, because I spent some time working in operations in the control room, and it was fundamental. You bring back your critical customers, then you start working out how many customers are on each feeder, and you restore them based upon, effectively from the node out, and then the people at the end of the feeder, there's been damage due to wind or trees, then they're without power, maybe they're without power longer, and it's just the way that the restoration works, because you try to bring back as many people as quickly as you can. But is that done in an equitable way? And is it always the people at the end of the feeders that are always the last ones to be brought back on during these events? And are the people that are rural, further out, on a lower income or a certain demographic or a certain age profile, and are we doing it in an equitable way? And it was one of those moments when we went, wow. And they were using the GIS, that same data layers I was talking about, to understand their customer profiling, to understand those demographic information, to then justify that they are restoring power in an equitable way. And that's now something that is built in. It's not something that's added at the end, right? I think they were a little bit lucky at the time. It wasn't at the forefront of their decision making, but it is now. So they are tracking their SAIDI, their SAFE, their CAIDI, all of those measurable KPIs, and are they doing those in an equitable way? And if your utility's not doing that, I dare say you will be doing it soon, because this is just something that is becoming more and more at the core of how you operate your organisation and your utility.
And if you put those customers at the center of your planning, then you really are planning for everybody and bringing everyone else to the table too. Bethany, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do on Slido, so don't forget to get your questions in, audience. Can you give your perspective on whether utility distribution system models should be open sourced to promote a fair market for DER integration?
So I think that and again, my background is being an attorney by training. So I apologize to the rest of the group, that's what I'm going to default to. One thing that I do want to be mindful of, and this is something that we are sensitive about as an industry, is security. And that's not an attempt to evade or say that the information shouldn't be available. It's that we're particularly mindful about the sensitivity of information. So that's why we share it with our commissions. The information is available either via our commissions, and in some cases there's ways that it's protected, but that's particularly the mindset of at least being sensitive about the degree of and the extent of the information that is available. There is some open source data on websites, especially when you're looking at outage maps and some basic GIS information. It's the granularity that starts to become a bit of a concern, and that's an issue that is, in some cases, it's mandated either by our state regulator, or in some cases, if it's, and I know the question pertained to distribution, but at the federal level on transmission. So those are obviously a sensitive area as it pertains to security of the energy grid. Yeah, I can just second that. So there's a place for open source. The ESRI platform's built. It's effectively a service-oriented architecture. We expose our REST endpoints. We have developers. We have a developer toolkit off to the side that expands the platform. Many of our partners just take that core foundation and build solutions on top of us. I think one of the challenges that are happening in the industry now is that as you start bringing your GIS and integrating it more as that enterprise system. So it's now working with your ADMS, which is effectively operating your network. It's heavily integrated back into your ADMS. You get these three big juggernaut systems playing together. You've really got to be careful about your security model. There's always patches coming through. Cybercrime is one of the biggest challenges that we face. So you want to be always keeping pace with security updates and those patches to make sure, especially now that we're tightly integral into an ADMS system, as we operate these networks.
Great, thank you. I have one more question for you guys. So Matt, this came up in a previous conversation we had that GIS's technology is moving more towards game engine technology, especially when it comes to the graphics. So could you talk about what exactly that means? What does that mean for utilities? Maybe where utilities are at that, along that journey?
Well, your theme has got the game engine sort of theme this year.
That's why I had to ask the question.
So it's got these nice square pixels, so a little bit Minecraft looking. I've got a 14-year-old son, and I got pretty excited. We're doing a presentation for digital twins, and we were fortunate enough that the island of Grenada actually reached out to ESRI, and they asked us to create a digital twin of the whole country, of that whole island of Grenada. So they sent us through 60 gigabytes of imagery data with point cloud and LiDAR, and they said, just make this digital twin thing happen, you know. So ESRI took that as a challenge, and we ingested all the data. We created this digital twin. We worked out all the potential landslides. We mapped all the rivers. We, using 3D extraction, you know, developed all the power lines. And it was this beautiful looking 3D, you know, view of Grenada. And, you know, we thought it was great. I called my son in, who's 14, and I was showing off and said, look what we've done. This is fantastic. I can zoom around. I can go down here. And he said, Dad, that's rubbish. He said, come and have a look at what my graphics in Forza are doing and Fortnite. And, you know, in a certain way, he's right? The technology at that end, when we think about digital twins and what we're doing in those game engines, is phenomenal. So ESRI has actually now developed integration through SDKs, the Unreal and the Unity engines. And what we're starting to do now is bring GIS, or bring the game engine technology into the GIS. And when you talk digital twins, it's not just what is happening now. Don't just show me the current state of the network or, you know, what's happened in the past. I need to start running simulations and what's going to happen in the future. So running these simulations in the game engine technology is starting to be really, really eye-opening to look at what you can simulate. What does the flood modelling look like? If there's a fire here and the wind's blowing in this direction, where's the smoke plume go? Where's the fire likely to spread to? And not just see it in 2D, but see it in 3D, see it as an immersive experience, as it's all integral. So we do see that this rapid development, as these two technologies, GIS and game engine technology, come together, that will be something I think will be one of those catalysts for decision-making moving forward and the adoption of 3D at utilities. You know, and as a utility, I think what we need to be mindful of is a couple of things. When you listen to Matt discuss the amount of data and types of data that's being utilized, this isn't just a one department issue. It's not just an operations team issue. This is, again, the historical perspective of breaking down the pillars within our own organizations, because it is going to result, and it's going to require departments that maybe historically haven't had to speak to each other before. Yep. To say, I need this type of data regarding demographics, while the operations team is utilizing it for what may be historically operational perspectives. So it's those breaking down of pillars, and then being mindful about the fact that our usage of the data is only as good as the data that is input. So not just relying or recognizing that maybe that where there could be any discrepancies, the quality of the data is going to be key. And I think those are the things that we as utilities are going to need to be mindful of as we start utilizing the type of technology that Matt's talking about, and in a greater fashion.
And you also don't want your younger employees that are coming in to think your graphics are rubbish. All right, well, we are just about out of time, so thank you guys both for joining me today. It's been a really fun conversation, and I hope y'all enjoyed it and find these guys out at the networking reception in a bit. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you.